Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I set out with the intention of saying something about what Zazen is and why we do it. And I think what makes that so difficult to talk about is that Zazen is precisely what is beyond words and is impossible to talk about. And I think what also makes Zazen difficult to talk about is that it is balance itself. Zazen is everything. And so to describe it in one way is incomplete if you do not describe it in the opposite of that way as well. I can imagine a world, a parallel world, in which everyone sits Zazen 12 hours a day. That Zazen is the joy of central to everyone's life. That it goes without question that people should sit this way. And I think if I lived in such a world, maybe I would advocate for recreational sports and tourism. But we do not live in that world. And I think that what is so important about Zazen is that it represents so much of what we lack in this modern society. That if we look at our collective balance, Zazen is, I think, in a lot of ways what we lack. I've been thinking a lot about something that I heard Suzuki Seido Roshi say. We were talking about someone he knew. I believe it was an acupuncturist, a man. Suzuki Roshi made the comment that he ended up killing himself, that he committed suicide. And in the comment that he made really resonated with me. He said that the man killed himself because he was living himself. That he was doing life as him. I think this is somewhat of an enigmatic thing to say, but I think it's very central to what Zen is and why we sit Zazen. Zazen is life. We come and we meet the immediacy of our experience. We tap into this creature that feels its own warmth, that occupies space, that is alive, that breathes. Zazen is also death, because there's so much that we delude ourselves into thinking that we are. These fictions that we weave, that we are X and Y and Z. This version of ourselves that's always living for something that hasn't happened yet. As if life were some destination that if only we were given a little bit more time we might reach to. Zazen is the death of that aspect of ourselves. Zazen is both life and death. And that it's where we sit and we see these two versions of ourselves interplay with one another. And that chaos that is enlivening, the source of creativity and inspiration. And Zazen transcends both life and death. And that it is beyond words, it is beyond conception, and it is the immediacy of our life right now, which is all of time. That there's nothing that is absent from it. This notion of suicide has been on my mind. It is just an influence that has sort of crept up here and there. And I think appropriately so. and that suicide rates are higher than they've ever been. And we do live in a time where I think many people are sensitive to the fact that it almost seems in this political landscape that our very future is somehow retreating. And so this question of why we live, why we keep going, why do we say yes to life, is, I think, a very timely one. And I think of the philosopher Camus, who said that the question of why you choose to live or die is really the central question of all philosophy. For in it you find your reason for living. And so I think of Zazen in this way. That Zazen is, I think, a profound answer as to why we keep going, of why we say yes to life, of why we go through the difficulty of taking time out of our day to come here and sit. Because it's actually pretty hard to say yes to life. It's pretty hard to meet it. So much of our culture, of our society, of modern life, is about immediate gratification, about fear, about base pleasure, which might not actually be as gratifying as we thought it would be. It's pretty hard to be conscious. It's pretty hard to inhabit a life. But to do so is beautiful. And what matters more than that? Does anything matter more than life itself? Of course, the idea of Zazen is that we don't confine it to this room, that we take it with us everywhere that we go, that it becomes innate to our being. Over time, it sort of radiates out from us. And in the wisdom of tradition, we call this practice. And the idea is that you are always practicing something. And without remembering this conscious awareness, without holding that, you were practicing the opposite of that. You were practicing passivity, unconsciousness, immediacy. So what does it mean to live yourself? I think that is such a rich expression. And why is that bad? Zazen is a very subtle thing. We're actually doing it right now, completely, without anything lacking from it. It's something that you've always had the right to, that no one could take away. It's perfectly complete in everyone. And I think the subtlety of it is something like this. We live in our default way as if we have life, as if it were something that we own, that we trade. But to come to Zazen is to realize that we don't own life, but that it owns us. That life is living us. And the wisdom and compassion of this may not seem immediately obvious, but I think it is such a compassionate way to hold ourselves and others. As the sutras say, you are not it. It actually is you. Maybe some of you have some questions. I hope this was encouraging. I know.
So the man killed himself because he was not aware that there was some it that was in him?
This is very dense, isn't it? It's very hard to talk about. I think to put it another way, the man was living a story of who he thought he was and what he thought life was and what he thought mattered. He was living in this conceptual place as to what a person is that was removed from this experiential way of being. Does that make sense?
Not a lot, but it's my first time, so.
In Zen, as I think all the wisdom traditions, there is the notion that there's nothing you can afford to get rid of. That everything has its place and everything has its purpose. And so we have to navigate the world. We have to have our personas and our egos of how we present who we are to people. But in Zazen, we go beyond this. We realize that who we are is actually much richer than this. To live as yourself, I think, is something like thinking, like I am this body, and it is sitting in this space, in this time. But to open to experience, and to allow life to live you, is like realizing that everything is your own mind, and that you aren't distant from everything, anything. That it's this oneness that the ancients speak of, but the actual experience of it, not in any theoretical way, but to experience that truth for oneself. And that people go their whole life without that is, I think, what works against us in profound ways.
While you were speaking, some couple lines from our Bodhisattva ceremony jumped into my mind. To live and be lived by all sentient beings. And on some level, we live our lives in a one-sided way. The self is living its life and kind of it holds this illusion of control, as if I'm directing my life in some way. And my sense is that you're pointing to that balance you were talking about. We do indeed live our lives. At the same time, what's the flip side of that? We're lived by all beings. And I think, is that what you were kind of pointing towards?
Well, when you say that, what comes to my mind is this notion. I got it from it was an orientation speech of David Foster Wallace. And he told a parable about two fish swimming one day, two young fish, and they pass an older fish who's going the other direction, and he says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And then one of the younger fish looks to the other, and he says, "You know, what the hell is water?" That is what we're talking about.
Okay.
Is this thing that's all around us that we miss because it's so obvious, it's so subtle, that it can just, you could go a whole life without really appreciating it. But it's life itself, really. It's this mind that we are in, that we're all participating in. You might not think that this is, you might think that this isn't quite empirical, or might not jive with Cartesian, whatever. And it doesn't. It is a reframe. The experience itself is the bedrock of what makes life worth living. And when we try to predicate that as to something else, it doesn't work out quite that well, because it isn't large enough. I think we need everything to make our lives and our society jive. I think it is the lack of this, what we might call a phenomenological perspective, that I think has a lot to do with how we are watching the world slowly die in sort of a state of apathy. How could that happen? Do we know that we can live without the world? Or that we are the world? That's what we're speaking about. To live in attunement with that reality, because it is true.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So, I'm just wondering, from this point of view, if someone came to you and said, you know, I'm just feeling like I can't go on anymore, I'm really thinking about suicide, what would you say to them? How does this Zazen point of view tie into what you'd say to such a person?
I think Zazen is a mode of being. It isn't a solution or a final point. It's not a conclusion. You don't get to it. It just is. And I think that that's one of the hardest things about people who suffer mentally or otherwise, is that they're so rarely listened to. It's actually quite common for people to feel that they live large portions of their life without any real meaningful contact, without being seen or heard in any meaningful way. And so I think the problems that plague people are complex, and they should be addressed and honored as such. But I think to have that instinct, that mode of being that just allows people's reality and is large enough to share that with them is very healing. And I think I hope that this answer sort of has the connotation that it isn't an answer, because people with problems don't need fixing. They don't need to be solved, but allowed. As probably worth noting, I think this is a great lesson of our teacher, who really likes this word allowing. That enlightenment is a pretty archaic kind of wonky word. But allowing is really what we're doing, is opening to life. I think doing that with people is very powerful. Does that answer your question?
No.
Well, we'll let it hang.
Hmm?
We'll let your question remain.
Just let it remain.
Yes.
I feel like a lot of what you have said is like a different way of thinking about things, or like reframing, as you said, and a lot of it didn't make sense to me, and that's fine. But I'm wondering, like, what advice you have for, because it seems like a lot of these things aren't meant to just come instantly, like they're meant to be thought about, or maybe just like experientially understood. But do you have any advice about like how to like authentically engage with what you're saying in the midst of like total confusion?
I think you have wonderful instincts. And you suggest great insight. You're already doing it.
Okay.
This is practice.
Okay.
And so, yes, we practice living experientially. And it's so weird that we have to do that. It's weird, but it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't live very experientially, I think, as a society. We're off in the future or the past, in our fantasies. But just to flex that muscle, which you have and you are using right now,
Okay.
is the only... What more is there?
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of questions I could ask you, but I almost feel like maybe I'm not supposed to.
We are limited by time.
Well, I mean, yeah. But I'm just wondering, like, because it's a different way of interacting
Yes.
with the teaching. So do you just suggest kind of living in the confusion and just experiencing things as they come?
I mean, that sounds wonderful to me.
Okay.
I remember when I first started practicing here, and I'm sort of the type that likes to read and think about things, and that was one of the first things I was told. And it really, I think, in the fullness of time, resonated so deeply and truly, is that in Zen one should read very sparingly.
Mm-hmm.
That we really come here to kind of flex those muscles that aren't conceptual, because sadly they're so in apathy in so many of us. But no, you're doing it, and that's I think a good reminder to point out that none of this is easy, that no one can do it for you, that it isn't mine to give, but your life to live. Meditation practice is something you choose to do or not. That seems like a good stopping point. Thank you all very much.